My name is Paige Whitaker. I'm 35 years old, and the day my grandfather's will was read changed my life forever. Everyone in my family gathered around the polished conference table inside a quiet lawyer's office, expecting to hear how his estate would be divided. My parents sat proudly beside my younger sister Lauren, already convinced they knew exactly how everything would unfold. Then the lawyer began reading. When Lauren's name was called, she smiled as she accepted paperwork confirming she had inherited nearly $6.9 million. My parents couldn't hide their excitement. My mother squeezed Lauren's hand while my father nodded with obvious satisfaction. Then the lawyer looked at me. He reached into the folder, removed a crisp $1 bill, and carefully slid it across the table. "To my granddaughter, Paige Whitaker," he read calmly, "I leave the sum of $1. Silence filled the room for only a heartbeat. Then my mother laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A victorious one. Lauren joined in, holding her inheritance papers like she'd just won the lottery. My father leaned back in his chair and quietly muttered, "Looks like you'll have to earn your own." My mother smiled directly at me. "I've always said it," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Some children simply never live up to their potential." The words should have hurt. Maybe years earlier they would have. But not that day. Instead, I calmly picked up the single dollar, folded it carefully, slipped it into my pocket, and looked at the lawyer. "Thank you," I said. No anger. No tears. No argument. Because I knew something they didn't. Hidden inside the lawyer's folder was another envelope. One my grandfather had personally instructed him to read only after the will. 40 seconds after that envelope was opened, my mother's smile disappeared forever. 4 years earlier, my life looked completely different. At the time, I was a high school teacher. I taught business classes and woodworking in a small town nearly 2 hours away from where I grew up. I loved my students. I enjoyed the work. I believed teaching would be my career for the rest of my life. Then one phone call changed everything. My grandfather had fallen. At first, everyone believed it was only a broken wrist. But during his hospital stay, doctors noticed something else. His hands shook constantly. More tests followed. The diagnosis came a few days later. Parkinson's disease. The doctors explained that while he could still enjoy many years of life, he would gradually lose the ability to manage daily responsibilities alone. The illness wouldn't disappear. It would slowly become harder each year. My grandfather wasn't just any retired man. He owned Whitaker Hardware, a family hardware and lumber store that had served our small town for over 50 years. People from several neighboring counties depended on it. Farmers stopped there before sunrise. Contractors relied on it every week. Children knew they'd leave with free candy whenever they visited. It wasn't just a business. It was part of the community. Someone needed to help him. So I called my parents. My mother sighed. "Oh, that's terrible," she said. "But your father and I have our own lives. We really can't move." Next, I called Lauren. She lived only 90 minutes away. No children. No major responsibilities. "I'll come when things calm down," she promised. They never did. Trips. Work. Friends. Vacations. There was always another excuse. I stood alone in the hospital hallway, realizing something. There were 3 people who could step forward. Only one actually would. Within 2 weeks, I resigned from my teaching position. Many people thought I was making a terrible mistake. My coworkers couldn't understand why I would leave a secure career. My mother certainly couldn't. She told everyone I had thrown away my future. My father barely commented at all. Neither of them asked what caring for Grandpa would actually involve. They never asked if I was frightened, or tired, or prepared. They simply assumed I had less to lose. When I moved back home, I settled into the small cottage behind my grandfather's farmhouse. Every morning, my alarm rang at 4:45. By 6 o'clock sharp, I unlocked Whitaker Hardware. Lights on. Coffee brewing. Cash register ready. The familiar smell of fresh lumber, machine oil, and old wood greeted me every morning. It looked completely ordinary. He placed it carefully into my hands. When Howard calls everyone together to read my will, he paused. "Bring this with you." I looked down at the tin. "What's inside?" He smiled. "You'll find out." I laughed. "That's not much of an answer." "It isn't supposed to be." Then his expression became serious again. "Promise me something. Anything. Let Howard read my letter before you say a single word." I nodded. "I promise." He gently squeezed my hand. "The truth doesn't need help. It only needs time." 11 days later, Grandpa was gone. He passed away peacefully in his own bed. I was sitting beside him holding his hand. Earlier that morning, I'd opened the hardware store at 6 o'clock. Just like always. When I returned home that evening, he was weaker than usual. We talked quietly for a while. His final question wasn't about money, or the business, or the future. He simply asked, "Did you fix the loading dock light?" I smiled. "I fixed it yesterday." He nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Good." Those were the last words he ever spoke. Even at the very end, he was thinking about the store, about keeping promises, not about possessions. After the funeral home arrived, I sat alone in the farmhouse for a long time. The silence felt overwhelming. Eventually, I picked up the old candy tin and carried it back to my cottage. I placed it on the kitchen table. For nearly an hour, I simply stared at it. I'd promised not to open it, but another thought kept returning. What if I needed to know what Grandpa wanted before facing the family? Finally, 2 days before the will reading, I carefully lifted the lid. Inside were only 3 items. Nothing more. Nothing less. The first was a copy of the purchase agreement. Every signature remained perfectly clear. Grandpa's. Mine. Howard Lynn's. The notary's seal. Everything was exactly as I remembered. Whitaker Hardware officially belonged to me. The transaction had been completed 2 years earlier. The second document was Dr. Holt's medical certification. It clearly stated that Grandpa fully understood every decision he made on the day he signed the sale. There could be no honest argument. No confusion. No misunderstanding. Every safeguard had been put in place. The final item was a single handwritten note. It wasn't written on expensive stationery. Just a torn piece of order paper from the hardware store. Grandpa's handwriting had become shaky during his illness, but every word remained perfectly readable. It said, "The store belongs to the person who opens it every morning." Then one final sentence. I changed nothing on my deathbed. I made this decision while I still drove myself to town. Anyone who says otherwise wasn't there. At the bottom, only 2 words. Love, Pop. That was the moment I finally cried. Not because I'd inherited the store. I'd already known that. I cried because I realized something much deeper. For years, I'd wondered whether anyone truly noticed the sacrifices I'd made. Whether anyone understood the mornings that began before sunrise, the missed holidays, the sleepless nights, the endless responsibilities. Grandpa had noticed every single one. He hadn't rewarded me out of sympathy. He hadn't chosen me because I was family. He had simply paid attention. He knew exactly who had shown up and who hadn't. I folded the note carefully and placed it back inside the tin. Then I closed the lid. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Not because of what I owned, but because the truth no longer depended on me explaining it. Everything was already written, signed, witnessed, protected. Soon, the people who had spent years judging my life would finally discover what Grandpa had seen all along. And they would learn it from the only voice they couldn't argue with, his own. The morning of Grandpa's funeral felt strangely unreal. The church was filled with people whose lives had somehow been touched by him. Farmers, contractors, neighbors, old friends, customers who had walked through the doors of Whitaker Hardware for decades. One after another, they approached me. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Your grandfather was a good man." "Thank you for keeping the store open." That last sentence kept repeating itself. Not one person thanked my parents. Not Lauren. They thanked me because they had seen who was there every morning. My mother, however, seemed more interested in appearances than memories. She cried beautifully whenever someone approached. She accepted sympathy with graceful smiles. Lauren posted a black and white photo of Grandpa online with the caption, "The greatest inspiration of my life." I couldn't remember the last time she'd spent an entire afternoon with him. But I said nothing. A funeral wasn't the place to settle old scores. During the reception after the service, my mother found me standing near the coffee table. She lowered her voice. "I hope you're keeping your expectations realistic." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You know your grandfather. He believed in success." She smiled politely. "Lauren built something with her life. You..." She paused. "Made different choices." Then came the sentence I'd heard so many times before. "Some children simply don't measure up." She squeezed my arm gently and walked away before I could answer. I watched her disappear into the crowd. For the first time, her words carried no weight, because sitting inside the old candy tin at home was everything she didn't know. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. During those few days, something strange happened. My parents suddenly became very interested in my feelings. Not because they were worried about me, because they expected disappointment. My father called. "Paige." He hesitated. "Don't take it personally if your grandfather left more to Lauren. He always admired ambition." I smiled quietly. "I understand." Then my mother called later that evening. "Promise me something." "What?" "When the lawyer announces everything, don't make a scene." I almost laughed. They honestly believed I would be devastated. "I won't." And I meant it, because I had absolutely no intention of arguing. The night before the reading, Lauren unexpectedly appeared at my cottage carrying a bottle of wine. He almost never visited. Certainly not without a reason. I thought we could spend some time together. We sat in the living room talking about meaningless things for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, she asked the real question. Did Grandpa ever give you anything? What do you mean? Letters. Papers. Instructions. She tried to sound casual. I just wondered if he trusted you with anything important. There it was. She wasn't visiting her sister. She was investigating. Some instinct told her there might be more to the story. I decided to answer honestly. We talked about the hardware store. She smiled. I figured. I'm sure he appreciated everything you did. She relaxed immediately. Apparently that answer satisfied her. She finished her wine and left. As I washed the glasses afterward, I realized something. She still believed I knew nothing. And by this time tomorrow, that belief would disappear forever. Tuesday morning arrived. I dressed simply, picked up Grandpa's candy tin, placed it carefully inside my bag, then drove to Howard Lynn's office. In the parking lot, my mother stopped me before I reached the entrance. She took both of my hands. Paige. Her voice sounded almost gentle. You've always been the strong one. You don't need money the way Lauren does. I just hope you'll let her enjoy today. It was amazing. For years I've been called a disappointment. Now suddenly I was strong. Only because they expected me to receive nothing. I smiled politely. I won't make today difficult. She looked relieved. Thank you. We walked inside together. She believed she had just convinced me to accept my place. In reality, the outcome had already been decided 2 years earlier. Howard Lynn greeted everyone warmly. The conference room felt unusually quiet. Around the table sat my parents, Lauren, an aunt, an uncle, me. Howard placed a thick folder in front of him. I want to begin by expressing my condolences. Everyone nodded. He adjusted his glasses. As instructed by Mr. Earl Whitaker, we'll first review the financial estate. Afterward, I've been directed to read a personal letter written by Mr. Whitaker. I felt my heartbeat slow. Everything was happening exactly as Grandpa had planned. Howard began reading. Investment accounts, savings, insurance policies, each amount carefully listed. The total estate came to approximately $6.9 million. My mother smiled. Lauren looked ready to celebrate. Howard continued. The estate will be divided equally between. He read their names, exactly as Grandpa intended. Then, he looked toward me, and to my granddaughter, Paige Whitaker. He reached into the folder. I leave $1. He removed a crisp bill clipped to the paperwork, placed it on the table, and gently slid it toward me. The room became perfectly silent for about 2 seconds. Then, my mother laughed. Not politely, openly. Lauren laughed too. My father avoided looking at me. Finally, he spoke quietly. Go earn your own. My mother leaned forward with complete confidence. I told you. Some children simply don't measure up. Every eye in the room turned toward me, waiting, expecting tears, anger, embarrassment. Instead, I calmly picked up the $1, folded it once, placed it inside my pocket. then looked at Howard. "Thank you." Nothing more. No argument. No emotion. No explanation. Howard nodded respectfully, then reached for the second envelope. "Before we conclude," he said, "Mr. Whitaker specifically instructed me to read this letter aloud." My mother smiled. "Please do." She assumed it would be a sentimental farewell. She had absolutely no idea. The next few minutes were about to destroy everything she believed. Howard carefully unfolded the letter. The room was silent. Even Lauren had stopped smiling. My mother leaned back in her chair, expecting nothing more than a heartfelt goodbye from her father. Howard adjusted his glasses and began reading. "To my family. But now you've heard how I chose to divide my savings and investments. I hope the money serves you well. I left it because I love you." My mother smiled proudly. Howard continued, "But before anyone makes assumptions about Whitaker Hardware, there's something you need to understand." The room grew noticeably quieter. Howard turned the page. 2 years ago, while I was still healthy enough to drive myself into town and fully understood every decision I was making, I sold Whitaker Hardware and the 40 acres behind it to my granddaughter Paige. My mother's smile disappeared. Howard kept reading. "This was not a gift. It was a legal business sale completed with an attorney, witnessed, notarized, and supported by medical certification, confirming I was mentally competent." Lauren slowly lowered the inheritance papers in her hands. Howard continued. "Paige is still paying for the business through a promissory agreement. She earned the opportunity by opening that store every morning while everyone else stayed home." The room was completely silent. No laughter. No smiles. Only disbelief. Howard reached the final paragraph. "I left Paige $1 in my will for one reason only. So no one could ever claim I forgot her." He looked around the table before reading the final lines. "The truth is, she is the only member of this family who never expected anything from me. She simply showed up. The store belongs to the person who opened it every morning. Love always, Earl Whitaker." Howard lowered the letter. Nobody moved. Not even for a second. Then my mother's chair slammed backward as she stood. "No." Her voice cracked. "That's impossible." She looked directly at me. "You manipulated him. You lived with him. You convinced a sick old man to sign everything over to you." Her hands shook with anger. "This is elder abuse. We're taking this to court." For the first time that morning, I spoke. Only one sentence. "He wasn't manipulated." I looked directly into her eyes. He was paying attention. Then I sat back down. Howard calmly opened another folder. I anticipated these concerns. He placed several documents on the table. The original purchase agreement. The notarized signatures. The promissory note. The physician's mental capacity certification. He slid each document toward my mother. She grabbed them one after another. "Read them." Then read them again. Every page confirmed exactly what Grandpa had written. The transaction had happened 2 years earlier. Everything had been legal. Everything had been documented. Everything had been witnessed. Howard folded his hands. As an attorney, I have to be honest. This isn't part of the estate. It cannot be distributed because your father no longer owned the business when he passed away. It was sold. There is nothing for the court to undo. My uncle quietly picked up the medical certificate. After reading it carefully, he looked across the table at me. Then he smiled. I guess Earl knew exactly what he was doing. He looked toward my mother. And apparently, Paige measured up after all. Nobody answered him. Lauren suddenly burst into tears. Not because Grandpa was gone, because reality had changed. So she gets the store. And the land? Howard nodded. Correct. Lauren looked at me. That's worth more than everything we inherited. There it was. The truth. She had never cared about Grandpa's dream. Only its value. I answered quietly. It isn't free. I'm still paying for it. I'm responsible for every bill, every employee, every repair, every morning. She looked away. My mother made one final attempt. You still have nothing, she almost shouted. You have to work every day. You'll never be rich. I smiled gently. I know. I never wanted to be. I wanted to keep Grandpa's promise. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out the folded $1 bill, held it for a moment, then slipped it back inside. This is worth more to me than millions, because it reminded me that Grandpa understood exactly who I was. I stood up, picked up my bag. Before leaving, I looked around the room one final time. I'm not taking anyone's inheritance. The money belongs to all of you. Grandpa wanted you to have it. I won't challenge that. But the hardware store belongs to me. It has for 2 years. I'm simply continuing the work I've already been doing. I paused. If any of you ever want to visit, you're welcome. As family, not as buyers. Then I smiled. But remember, the door is still open at 6 every morning. And I walked away. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm on my face. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not because I had won, because I no longer had to prove anything. The truth had spoken for itself. Exactly as Grandpa wanted. I drove directly to Whitaker Hardware, unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, walked behind the old wooden counter. Everything looked exactly the same. The shelves, the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the worn cash register, the old coffee pots still waiting to be filled. I smiled. I kept my promise, Pop. Months passed. My mother hired 2 different attorneys. Both gave her the same answer. The sale was legal. There was no case. Eventually, she stopped trying. Lauren received millions. Within a few years, most of it was gone. Luxury vacations, expensive cars, bad investments. The money disappeared as quickly as it arrived. One evening she called me. Not to borrow money, not to argue, just to ask one question. What was Grandpa really like during his last days? I told her everything. The stories, the laughter, the flood of 1978, the church picnic where he met Grandma, the loading dock light. By the end of the conversation, she was crying. Real tears this time. For the first time in years. We talked like sisters. My father slowly began visiting the store. Sometimes he'd wander through the aisles without saying much. Occasionally, he'd pick up a broom and quietly start sweeping the floor. He never apologized. He didn't know how. But somehow, that was his apology. And I accepted it. My relationship with my mother never truly recovered. She never admitted she had been wrong. Never apologized. Never said she was proud of me. Eventually, I stopped waiting. Some people spend their entire lives measuring success with money. They never learn another way. I couldn't change her. So I stopped trying. Today, Whitaker Hardware still opens every morning at 6. The coffee is always ready. The lights come on before sunrise. Farmers still stop by before work. Neighbors still gather to talk. The promise continues. Exactly as Grandpa wanted. His handwritten note hangs inside the register where only I can see it. Every morning before unlocking the door, I read this same sentence. The store belongs to the person who opens it every morning. Those words remind me of something far more valuable than money. A legacy isn't given to the loudest person, or the richest, or the one who talks the most. A true legacy belongs to the person who quietly keeps showing up when everyone else has gone home. And that's exactly what Grandpa saw. The rest of my family inherited his fortune. I inherited his life's work. Looking back, I know which one was the greater gift. Farmers arrived before sunrise looking for parts to repair broken tractors. Construction workers needed tools before heading to job sites. Neighbors stopped in simply to chat. The store had opened at 6 every morning since 1974. My grandfather believed that wasn't just a schedule. It was a promise. If someone depends on you, he'd often say, "You don't sleep in." After opening the store, I'd check on Grandpa. Prepare breakfast. Organize medications. Help him dress. Then I'd return to work until lunchtime. Back to the farmhouse. Then back to the store. Every single day followed the same routine. It was exhausting, but I never regretted it. Some afternoons, Grandpa still insisted on sitting behind the register. He couldn't work the way he once had, but he loved watching familiar faces come through the front door. One quiet morning, he looked at me while customers browsed the aisles. "You know how I can always tell who truly owns a business?" I smiled. "How?" He nodded toward the front entrance. "The person who unlocks the door every morning." At the time, I thought he was simply being sentimental. I smiled and continued stocking shelves. I didn't realize he was telling me exactly how he measured loyalty. The hardware store wasn't making anyone rich. Some months, the profits barely covered expenses. But it kept 4 employees working. It supported local families. Most importantly, it carried my grandfather's name above the front door. To him, that mattered more than money. To my parents, it was just valuable land waiting to be sold. I noticed it almost immediately. Whenever they visited Grandpa, they rarely asked how his treatments were going. Instead, they looked out the farmhouse window toward the property. "You know," my father said one afternoon, "this land must be worth a fortune now that they're building the new highway." My mother nodded. "Earl, have you considered selling? It could make life much easier." Grandpa smiled politely. "I've considered everything." Then he looked across the room at me and winked. At the time, I didn't understand why. Now I know he already had a plan. Every visit became the same conversation. "How much is the property worth? Has anyone offered to buy it? Wouldn't retirement be easier with cash instead of a business?" They called it concern. I recognized it as curiosity. Not about Grandpa. About his assets. After every visit, they drove home. I stayed. I opened the store the next morning, prepared Grandpa's medicine, cooked dinner, helped him into bed, then woke up before sunrise and did it all again. I never complained. I simply kept showing up because someone had to. And deep down, I suspected my grandfather noticed far more than anyone realized. As Grandpa's health slowly declined, I began noticing something that became impossible to ignore. Every visit from my parents followed the exact same pattern. They rarely asked whether he had slept well. They never wondered if his medication was helping. Not once did they ask if he felt lonely after the store closed for the day. Instead, every conversation somehow drifted back to the same subject. Money. One Saturday afternoon, my father stood on the farmhouse porch, staring across the 40 acres behind Whitaker Hardware. "The value of this land has gone through the roof," he said. "Once that new highway is finished, developers will be lining up." My mother smiled. "You've worked hard your whole life, Earl. Why not sell everything and enjoy the money while you still can?" Grandpa simply sipped his coffee. "I appreciate the concern," he replied. "But I've already made my plans." That answer frustrated them every time. On the drive home, they probably convinced themselves he simply hadn't made a decision yet. I knew better. Whenever they left, Grandpa would glance toward me with the same quiet smile. He never explained what he meant. He didn't have to. He was watching them just as carefully as I was. Lauren visited a little more often than our parents, but she almost never came empty-handed. There was always a problem. A car repair. A rent increase. A credit card payment. A vacation she had already booked, but suddenly couldn't afford. Every visit ended exactly the same way. She'd spend a few private minutes talking with Grandpa. Then she'd walk out holding another check. Grandpa never complained. He loved all of us. Helping his family made him happy. What bothered me wasn't the money. It was Lauren's attitude. One afternoon, she looked around the hardware store while slipping another check into her purse. "I honestly don't understand how you live like this," she said. I looked up from stocking shelves. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "This place." She gestured around the store. "It's old. Dusty. A complete money pit." Then she laughed. "You quit an actual career for this?" I glanced toward the front counter. Just minutes earlier, we'd helped a young mother who had accidentally locked herself out of her house. A farmer had stopped by before sunrise because a broken tractor could have cost him an entire day's harvest. To me, this wasn't just a store. It mattered. But Lauren only saw peeling paint and outdated shelves. She couldn't understand why anyone would choose purpose over status. I simply smiled. If it makes Grandpa happy, that's enough. She rolled her eyes. "You're wasting your life." Then she climbed into her car and drove away. Inside, Grandpa had heard every word through the open front door. He waited until her car disappeared before speaking. "Money flows through some people like water through a cracked bucket," he said quietly. "They never keep it." Then he looked directly at me. "You know how to protect what matters." At the time, I thought he was simply encouraging me. Looking back, he was giving me another clue. Thanksgiving that year became the moment I finally understood how my mother truly measured people. The whole family gathered at Grandpa's farmhouse. As usual, I cooked nearly everything. Turkey, mashed potatoes, homemade rolls, pie, Between serving dinner and clearing dishes, I also helped Grandpa take his evening medication. No one else even noticed. Lauren spent most of dinner talking about a promotion she had supposedly received. My mother couldn't stop praising her. "She's always been so ambitious," she said proudly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she turned toward me. "And how's your little hardware store?" "It's doing well," I answered. "Busy." She gave me a sympathetic smile. "Oh, Paige, it still makes me sad." "What does?" "You had such a respectable career." She shook her head. "You were a teacher. You could have become a principal someday." Instead, she looked around the dinner table. "You chose to play shopkeeper in a tiny town." A few relatives laughed awkwardly. Then she delivered the sentence I never forget. "Sometimes children simply don't reach their potential." The room became strangely quiet. No one defended me. My father focused on his plate. Lauren pretended not to hear. Grandpa said nothing. Neither did I. But something inside me changed forever. For the first time, I realized my mother judged success almost entirely by appearances. Fancy careers, expensive neighborhoods, big salaries, stories that impress strangers. By those standards, I had failed. It didn't matter that I was caring for her father every single day. It didn't matter that I'd sacrificed my career without hesitation. None of that counted. Not in her world. I didn't argue. There wasn't any point. Instead, I quietly thought something I never said aloud. One day, the truth will speak for itself. I had no idea Grandpa had already made sure it would. That winter became especially difficult. Parkinson's continued stealing little pieces of Grandpa's independence. Some mornings his hands shook too much to button his own shirt. Other days, walking across the living room became exhausting. Still, his mind remained sharp. One cold evening, we sat together in the farmhouse kitchen. Snow covered the fields outside. He stared silently into his cup of tea before speaking. "When I'm gone," he paused, "they'll sell the store." I knew exactly who he meant. "My parents?" He nodded. "They don't see a business. They see land. They see money." He looked toward the window where the lights of Whitaker Hardware glowed in the distance. "I built that place from nothing. My father started with almost nothing. I turned it into something our town could depend on." He smiled sadly. "I always imagined one of my children would protect it." Then he looked directly into my eyes. "But it wasn't your father. And it certainly wasn't Lauren." His voice softened. "It was you. You've opened those doors every morning. You've kept my promise alive." He leaned forward. "If I find a way to make sure nobody can ever take that store away from you..." He stopped. "Will you keep it open?" The question caught me completely off guard. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about ownership. It was about responsibility. Keeping Whitaker Hardware alive wasn't a reward. It was a commitment. A lifetime one. I swallowed hard. "Yes, I promise." He smiled. Then I added something else. "If we're going to do this, it has to be done the right way." He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "If you simply leave me the store in your will, they'll challenge it. They'll claim you weren't thinking clearly. They'll say I manipulated you. They'll drag everything through court. Grandpa stared at me silently. They'll never stop fighting unless every detail is protected. A slow smile spread across his face. I suppose you've been paying attention. I've had good teachers. He chuckled. Apparently you have. That conversation would become the beginning of everything. Not because it made me wealthy, but because it gave my grandfather an idea that would completely change what happened after he was gone. Neither my parents, nor Lauren, had any idea that while they were planning their inheritance, Grandpa was quietly protecting the one thing they wanted most. The following week, Grandpa asked me to drive him into town. He didn't say much during the ride. Neither did I. Something about the way he quietly looked out the window told me he had already made up his mind. When we arrived, we stopped in front of a law office. The sign on the building read, Howard Lynn, estate and business attorney. Grandpa smiled. I'll only be a little while. As we walked inside, he stopped before entering the conference room. I'd like to speak with Mr. Lind alone. I nodded immediately. Of course. That decision turned out to be one of the smartest either of us ever made. I spent nearly an hour sitting quietly in the waiting room. I never once asked what they discussed. I didn't want anyone to ever claim I had pressured him into anything. When Grandpa finally walked out, he looked lighter than he had in months. As we drove home, he simply said, Everything's moving in the right direction. That was all. Over the next several weeks, we returned to Howard Lynn's office a few more times. Each visit followed the same routine. Grandpa met privately with the attorney. I remained outside. No conversations. No suggestions. No influence. If anyone ever questioned his decisions, no one could honestly say I had been involved. One afternoon after another meeting, Grandpa looked at me with a grin. I think we've built ourselves a pretty solid wall. I smiled. What kind of wall? The kind that keeps greedy people out. A few days later, Howard invited us back for what would become the final meeting. This time, Grandpa asked me to join him. Howard placed several neatly organized documents on the table. He looked first at Grandpa. Mr. Whitaker, before we continue, I need to ask you once again. Are you making these decisions freely? Yes. Has anyone pressured you? No. Do you fully understand every document you're about to sign? I do. Howard nodded with satisfaction. Everything was being documented exactly as the law required. Then he turned toward me. Paige, your grandfather has chosen not to transfer the hardware store through his will. I looked surprised. He smiled. Instead, he's selling it to you. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Selling it? Howard continued explaining. If the property stays inside the will, it can be challenged after his passing. But if ownership transfers today, while your grandfather is mentally competent, then the property is no longer part of the estate. Grandpa looked at me. They can argue with my will. They can't argue with a completed sale. Howard nodded. Exactly. Of course, I couldn't simply write a check. The business, the land, and the buildings were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Howard already had a solution. He placed another document in front of me. This is a promissory note. You'll purchase the business through long-term payments. The store's future profits will gradually repay the agreed price. In other words, I wasn't receiving a gift. I was taking on a debt. A real legal obligation. I would spend years paying for the business. Grandpa smiled proudly. My father sold the store to me almost the same way. Now I'm passing it forward. I picked up the pen. If you're sure. I've never been more sure of anything. They would have demanded explanations. Accused me of manipulation. Filled his remaining years with arguments. I refused to let that happen. Instead, I allowed them to believe exactly what they already believed. That I had sacrificed everything. That I had ruined my future. That I was the unsuccessful daughter. Every holiday, my mother repeated the same comments. You could have done so much more with your life. Lauren called the hardware store a dying business. My father rarely defended me. Sometimes their words hurt. Sometimes they made me question myself. But then I remember Grandpa's handshake. His smile. The signed documents safely locked away inside Howard's office. The truth didn't need defending. Not yet. Those 2 years became the loneliest period of my life. Not because of the work. The work never bothered me. It was the pretending. Pretending their insults didn't sting. Pretending I had nothing. Pretending I wasn't carrying the future of our family's business on my shoulders. More than once I wanted to tell them everything. To place the paperwork on the dinner table and watch their expressions change. But I never did. Grandpa deserved peace. Not family wars. So I stayed quiet. I kept opening the store every morning at 6. Exactly like always. Without realizing it, I wasn't just protecting a business. I was protecting the man who had built it. And someday, when the time was right, the truth would speak for itself. The last 2 years of Grandpa's life were the most challenging and the most meaningful years I had ever experienced. By then, Parkinson's had taken away much of his strength. Some mornings he struggled just to button his shirt. Other days he couldn't hold a coffee mug without both hands shaking. Yet despite everything happening to his body, his mind remained remarkably sharp. There were difficult days, of course, but there were also beautiful ones. Every evening after closing Whitaker Hardware, I'd return to the farmhouse. I'd cook dinner while Grandpa sat nearby telling stories from decades ago. He loved talking about the flood of 1978. He laughed every time he described how half the town showed up with sandbags before sunrise. Sometimes he'd tell me about meeting Grandma at a church picnic when they were barely 20. Other nights, he'd simply ask how business had gone that day. Busy? Pretty busy. Good. He'd smile like that. Answer alone made everything worthwhile. Those quiet conversations became the best part of every day. Taking care of someone you love changes you. It teaches patience. It teaches humility. Most importantly, it teaches you that real love rarely looks dramatic. It looks like helping someone stand when their legs won't cooperate. It looks like organizing medications, cooking meals, cleaning the kitchen, sitting beside a hospital bed without saying a word. Nobody applauds those moments. Nobody posts them on social media. But they matter, more than almost anything else. Meanwhile, life continued for everyone else. Lauren posted photos from tropical vacations, weekend getaways, luxury restaurants, designer shopping trips. Every picture came with cheerful captions about living your best life. My mother mailed Grandpa birthday cards, rarely visited. My father occasionally called, almost never stayed long. I wasn't angry anymore, just aware. There's a special kind of loneliness that caregivers understand. Not because they're physically alone, but because everyone else slowly returns to normal life, while theirs becomes centered around someone else's needs. I never resented Grandpa. Never once. But I did notice who stayed and who disappeared. One evening, only a few weeks before he passed away, Grandpa called me into his bedroom. His voice sounded unusually serious. "There's something I want you to have." He slowly opened the bottom drawer of his dresser. From the back, he pulled out an old metal candy tin. The paint had faded years earlier. One corner was dented,